Hello everyone, welcome again to Social Psychology, Psychology 346. And today we're going to be talking about self-relevant motives. So we're going to be talking about some different ways of understanding the self, or motivations that people have to understand themselves that can be beneficial or detrimental depending on certain situations. Excuse me. So let's start off by talking about self-enhancement. Generally, people are motivated to maintain high levels of self-esteem. We talked about self-esteem. High levels and moderate to high levels can be great. Especially, people are motivated to maintain high levels of self-esteem after threats. And this can dominate other needs. This is oftentimes a very quick, efficient, and affect-based process. Healthy people often engage in self-illusory thinking without even realizing it. And people tend to enhance their own self-beliefs and self-worths relatively automatically. Other times, people can focus on self-verification. This is the idea of maintaining consistency and the idea that feelings of hypocrisy or feeling like you're kind of flip-flopping on some behaviors or issues is aversive. Oftentimes, we structure the environment to preserve our views. These are more slower and cognitively based processes as compared to the ideas of self-enhancement, where we're just automatically going to try and feel happy about ourselves. Again, we're focusing on self-verification, we're focusing on maintaining consistency, so we're not always putting these positive feelings at the forefront of the goals. So we don't always feel positive. So for example, we don't always like to feel complimented. Complimented can increase and boost our self-esteem, especially within the framework of self-enhancement. But within the framework of self-verification, it can actually be aversive at times. So if someone, for example, compliments us when we have low self-esteem, that just doesn't feel right. If someone gives us a compliment when we know we did poorly on something, that also doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel like it's consistent. It feels hypocritical. And we also don't feel quite right about being complimented when we believe the evaluator is ingratiating in some way or is not necessarily being truthful. So we have self-enhancement, we have self-verification. Another way of viewing the self is through self-appraisal. And this is focusing on learning the truth about oneself. This is a more realistic view of the self. When might this be advantageous? Well, before taking an exam. We may realize that we're not necessarily as prepared as we should be. Maybe we don't know the materials as much as we should before taking an exam. So having a realistic view of the self as compared to the goals of self-enhancement or self-verification could help us and motivate us to, for example, study before the exam. Maybe before going skydiving, having self-appraisal would be advantageous. Knowing that we are ready to jump out of a plane, that we are prepared, can help us get over some of the anxieties of throwing yourself out of a plane thousands of feet in the air. Another skill that we have is self-presentation. We like to be able to influence and control the impressions that other people have of us. We want to appear in a good light. We want to appear likable, we want to appear competent, and we also want to appear powerful. And these are all goals that almost everyone has. There are some certain tricks that we can use to appear more, for example, powerful or competent. Power posing is one such example. And we often see presidents behave and use nonverbal communication in such a way to impose power or impose competency on other people that they meet to appear likable, competent, and powerful. Additionally, we sometimes see what's known as self-monitoring, and this is when individuals basically modify their versions of the self depending on the situation that they're in. So we sometimes call these people social chameleons, and these individuals have relatively low cross-situational consistency. They tend to change who they are depending on the situation. Person might be really into sports if they're around people who are of the same mind, and then maybe they decide that they hate sports and are really into nerdy stuff, like video games, for example, if they're around people who don't really follow sports. So they might basically give the impression that they are completely different people depending on who they're around and the environment that they're in. Other people do have pretty strong cross-situational consistency and tend to be themselves no matter who they're talking to or no matter what environment that they're in. But we do see that high self-monitors tend to modify who they are. They're very aware of their surroundings. Additionally, we see what's known as self-handicapping occur every now and then. That's when an individual basically undermines their own performance to justify future failures. So instead of preparing for an exam that they're going to take, if maybe they don't think they're prepared enough or they don't really think they're going to do very well on the test, they might go out drinking the night before rather than trying to study and trying to do better on the exam. So people are basically constructing excuses for the failure that hasn't actually occurred yet beforehand. We see that individuals who are especially likely to self-handicap tend to be people who might think that the previous successes that they may have had in that certain domain, such as exams, were not due to their own skill, but to outside circumstances. Maybe the test was just really easy that day. And we also see that individuals with low self-esteem are more likely to self-handicap as well. We also see individuals fall into self-serving biases quite frequently, and we tend to see that successes tend to be driven by the self, and failures tend to be driven by external factors or other people. So if I do well on a test, it's because I studied really hard or because I'm smart. And if I do poorly on a test, it's not my fault. It's because the professor made the test really hard. Or it's because I didn't get much sleep the night before because my roommate was up all night. Blaming other people for failures and giving yourself credit for successes. Additionally, we can see differences in terms of whether or not we as individuals want to be distinct or whether we want to fit in with other people and be similar to others. This can be differences between the individual self wanting to be distinct and unique and our collective self wanting to be similar with others and to fit into groups. We can see individual differences in the emphasis given to both individual and collective selves. And we can also see cultural differences. So certain cultures, for example, East Asian cultures, put a larger focus on collective selves, whereas more Western cultures, such as the United States, put a greater emphasis on individual selves. Additionally, we can see differences in how we're motivated to behave in certain ways. So differences between internal and external forms of motivation, or intrinsic versus extrinsic forms of reward. So a more intrinsic reward would be the good and happy feelings you get from succeeding, whereas a more extrinsic reward would be actual objects that you receive, whether it be money or a trophy or other gifts for performing well. We tend to see that the type of reward that is given tends to impact and influence performance and enjoyment in a task. And we need to be wary of what's known as the over-justification effect. Yes, extrinsic rewards can be good when used in moderation, but generally we want to focus on intrinsic rewards. If we want a person to continue to perform a specific behavior, we want them to do so because they genuinely enjoy doing it, not because they're getting something in return for it. Sometimes, in terms of the over-justification effect, we see that individuals might enjoy performing a specific behavior, but once they start getting external rewards or becoming externally motivated to perform the behavior, they start to lose the internal motivation, and those intrinsic rewards tend to be not fulfilling enough for performing the behavior. So individuals who were initially motivated to behave in this way because they enjoyed it end up not wanting to perform the behavior at all unless there's this external motivation. Additionally, similar to the differences between individual selves and collective selves, we can see differences in self-control, namely differences between individualistic tendencies and more collectivistic tendencies. And this can also coincide with independent self-controls and interdependent self-controls. This is basically the difference between focusing on me as a person, as an individual separate from others, versus me as a member of a group or a collective or a community. And lastly, we see that basically all people have both personal and collective self-concepts. People do have this understanding that they are an individual separate from others and that they are a person part of groups connected with others. There just tends to be a shift in tendency with how much emphasis is placed on each of these understandings. Culture can often prime whether one specific self-control or the other is kind of thrust into focus. And the situation can oftentimes override culture. If the focus of a task at hand is to be an individual, people will shift towards an individual self-control. If the focus instead is to work with others, then people will focus more on an interdependent self-control. The self is very flexible in how it interprets itself and how it can understand itself, and it can shift depending on a culture a person is in, the situation a person is in, or the specific task at hand. So that's all I have today. Thank you again for your time and attention. I will see you next time. Thanks.